everybody, and welcome back. Welcome back to our video coaching sessions here for those of you who are going to be teaching a small group on Sunday mornings at Dayspring. In particular, if you're teaching the first Sunday of September, good to see you here. We've taken a break from these video coaching sessions throughout the summer. As you know, that's your time to teach something that you've really been dying to teach or something that's really been on your heart. And now that summer's over, we're back on our church-wide lessons where we're all teaching the same thing and growing in the same direction. And this video coaching session is to help you get ready to teach that very first lesson on September the 6th. So thanks for being here, and good to see you. You should have your teaching transcript with you now, the one dated September the 6th. If you'll go ahead and grab that, print it out if you haven't done it yet. You can go ahead and hit pause and print it. But get that and grab something to write with, because I'm going to be teaching you through this lesson, helping you get ready to teach it on Sunday morning. So let me give you a big picture here of what this lesson is all about. And after I talk through the big picture, then we'll look at some specifics in your lesson here. The big picture of this lesson is a complement lesson to the sermon, which is what we always do. The sermon is going to be found in John chapter 8, and it has to do with the account of Jesus dealing with this woman who's been caught in the act of adultery. You're probably familiar with the passage in John 8. There are some religious people who are trying to trap Jesus, and the way that they decide to try and trap him is to catch this woman in the act of adultery and try and make Jesus deal with it right then and there. But you know how this thing plays out. Jesus, he's not going to be trapped or tricked by them. So when they bring this woman who's been caught in the very act of adultery, which raises a lot of questions for me personally, they bring her and throw her there in front of Jesus, and you know how Jesus responds. He just kind of quietly draws in the sand for a while. I wish I could see what he drew there. But clearly it was significant as to how things are going to play out here. He draws a little bit in the sand, and then he tells these guys, he says, I tell you what, if any of you are without sin, go ahead and throw the first stone. And you know what happens. They, one at a time, drop their stones and get out of there. And then Jesus finishes this whole account with a beautiful, beautiful thing. He tells this woman, he says, no one's here to condemn you. He says, including me, because you can now go and abandon this life of sin that you've been living in. He tells her, go and sin no more. It's a wonderful, wonderful account that we read there in John chapter 8. Now, some hear a passage like that, and they hear Jesus saying, no one is here to condemn you, including me. And their conclusion is that what Jesus was teaching us is that we should never cast judgment on sin and on people. In fact, they'll point to things that Jesus said, like in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. They'll say, Jesus said point blank, judge not, lest ye be judged. So there are people who will say, look, we have no right whatsoever to judge sin and to stand in judgment over sin. Now that begs the question, when people say that we have no right to judge sin, what do they mean by that? Well, typically what they mean is this. What they mean is this. How dare you tell me not to do what makes me happy? How dare you tell me that what I'm doing, even though it makes me happy, how dare you tell me that that is sin? Here's the deal. When Jesus taught us, judge not, Jesus wasn't telling us that we had no right to call sin, sin. That's not what he was telling us at all. You say, well, what was he telling us? Well, that's what this lesson is all about. You're actually going to be teaching from Matthew chapter 7, which is the very passage where Jesus says, don't judge lest you be judged. You're going to be teaching through what Jesus wasn't saying there. You're going to be teaching through what Jesus actually was saying, and you're going to show what the end result is. Because Jesus actually teaches us that there is a way that we are to exercise judgment. So what is that? Well, that's what this lesson is all about. So let's look at it together, all right? Page 1 is your intro page there. That's not a page you teach. Your lesson actually starts on page 2. This is where you start teaching. So as you look at page 2, that's a simple intro that gets you into Matthew chapter 7. I'm not going to read that to you or go over it with you because it's pretty self-explanatory. So move over to page 3. This is where you actually start teaching the lesson from Matthew chapter 7. And you've got a 3-point outline this week, okay? Point 1 is found right here on page 3. Now, before I get to those 3 points, let me read you your passage today. Matthew chapter 7. You're going to be reading verses 1 through 5. So let me read those to you. It says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the same measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly how to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Now that's the passage that you're going to be teaching, and you've got 3 points you're going to make. Here's the first one. Look at page 3. What Jesus is not saying. What Jesus is not saying. And here's what Jesus is not saying. What Jesus is not saying is that we have no right or ability to call something wrong. That's not what Jesus is saying. And that's what most people say that Jesus is saying. When they quote Matthew 7, verse 1, which they always stop at verse 1, they say, Jesus said, "Don't judge." That's the most quoted verse in the Bible now. Don't judge. But what that does not mean is that we can't look at something and say definitively, that is wrong. And here's the thing. Even people that quote that verse at you, as if to say, hey, you can't tell me that things are wrong. Nobody believes that you can't call something wrong. Nobody believes that. If somebody ever tells you that we have no right to make moral evaluations of right and wrong, simply ask them this as a follow-up. Say, so what you're telling me then is that what Hitler did wasn't wrong, that it wasn't bad. Look, everybody knows that what Hitler did was wrong and bad, because we all know that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And Jesus isn't telling us here in Matthew chapter 7 that we can't acknowledge that this is right and this is wrong. That's not what he's telling us. And in fact, on page 3, you actually have a couple of evidences of that right here in your text that show us that that's not what Jesus is saying. And those are spelled out for you on page 3, and you can work through those with your group, all right? Now move over to page 4. This is the second point of your lesson, which is what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is saying. So if he's not saying that I can't call a certain action sin, that I actually can call something sin, what is Jesus saying then? Here's the deal. Context is important. I talked about this last Sunday when I was preaching, that sometimes chapter divisions throw us off a little bit because we think it's like a new thought or a new idea, but oftentimes it's not. And this is one of those cases. Matthew 7 and Matthew 6 really flow together. And if you were to go back into Matthew 6, here's what you're going to find. You're going to find a lot of things that I think Jesus would like to see us doing. He's just telling us that we can do those good things in a way that makes us a hypocrite. He says you can pray, but you can pray in such a way that you're being a hypocrite. You can fast or spiritual exercise, but you can do it in such a way that you're being a hypocrite. You can give, he tells us in chapter 6. You can give, but you can do it in such a way that you're being a hypocrite. Now we move into chapter 7, and you know what I think Jesus is saying? He's saying you can judge, and you can do it in such a way that you're being a hypocrite. That's what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying don't judge at all. He's saying don't judge in such a way that you're doing it out of hypocrisy. That's what Jesus is saying. And it's important for us to understand this. So you see that on your lesson there. It's in bold print. What Jesus is saying, he's saying don't judge others hypocritically. So that begs the question, what does that mean? What does it mean to judge someone hypocritically? And the answer to that question is right there on the bottom of page 4. Hypocritical judgment focuses only on other sins, but godly judgment starts with yourself. That's what Jesus is saying here. And you hear him saying this. Don't judge in such a way that you're going to fall under judgment. Don't ignore the sin in your own life while trying to point out the sin in other people's lives. And in fact, look, that John chapter 8 passage that's going to be preached Sunday, that's exactly what Jesus was dealing with. He had a bunch of hypocrites who had come to him trying to get him to deal with the sin of this woman. And it wasn't that she didn't have sin, but they were being hypocrites, and he called them out on it. And they knew, however they knew it, whether it was him writing in the sand or something else, they knew we have sin that that cannot be ignored, and Jesus just called us out on that. You know, it even reminds me of at the end of Jesus' ministry. If you recall, Peter denies Jesus 3 times as Jesus is about to be crucified. And then after Jesus is crucified and resurrected, and he spends time with his disciples afterwards, if you remember this beautiful moment where Jesus now restores Simon Peter. You know, Simon Peter has denied Jesus 3 times, and now Jesus gives him the chance 3 times to tell Jesus that he loves him and is committed to him. And it's this beautiful picture of Jesus restoring a sinner back into good graces, and now Jesus is commissioning him really to go and advance the gospel. And Jesus tells him, as part of this whole process, Jesus tells Simon Peter, he says, Simon Peter, basically you've been restored now, and you're going to follow me, and you're going to do my work. And Jesus tells him, he says, as part of following me, that means that you're now going to die like me. Jesus tells him, it's going to be a tough finish for you, Simon Peter, as you do my work, and as you're now my ambassador on this earth. They're going to stretch your arms out, and you're going to die the same way that I did. And in that moment, Simon Peter's listening to Jesus, but apparently he kind of glances over and he sees John, the other apostle, and he says to Jesus in the midst of all that, he says, okay, Jesus, I hear what you're saying, but what about him? What about John? And Jesus replies with what to me is some of the funniest words in all of Scripture, even though it's not a funny moment. Peter says, what about him? And Jesus replies with these words, what's it to you? I mean, that's literally what Jesus said. What is it to you how he dies? And Jesus is making the point, hey, Simon Peter, don't miss the point here. I'm talking about how you follow Jesus. How does what he does in his fellowship of Jesus, how does that keep you from following me the way that you're supposed to? You see, here's the whole point here. Here's the whole point of what Jesus is saying. And maybe you'll even word it this way as you teach the lesson Sunday. This is probably how I would word it. What Jesus is saying is this, that your own sin ought to be a bigger deal to you than any other sin. Your own sin ought to be a bigger deal to you than any other sin. And to deal with it any other way is hypocrisy. In fact, I think Jesus is making this point with his illustration. As you flip over into page 5, think about this. Jesus is saying your own sin ought to be a big deal to you. Think about the analogy that he uses here in Matthew 7. Listen to it again. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? You've got a big log here in your own eye, and you're worried about this little speck of sin in somebody else's eye. Now, on page 5, look, you're going to do something here to really make this point. The point that you're making is that your own sin ought to be the biggest sin, the biggest and worst sin that you can imagine. You're going to make that point by asking this question. Look on page 5. It says, what are your thoughts about the statement that all sins are equal? Now, if I were to ask you, are all sins equal? How would you answer that question? The answer to that question is yes and no. All sins are equal in this sense that there's no sin that God sees that is not equally offensive. There's no such thing as a little sin or a big sin in the sense that, oh, this sin won't separate me from God because it's only little. This sin does separate me from God because it's big. There's no such thing as a big or little sin in that regard, but Jesus actually does teach that there are sins that ought to be more bothersome to us. In John chapter 19, you're going to read that passage to make that point because Jesus talks about a quote-unquote greater sin in that context. Now, is all sin equally offensive and wrong and sinful before God? Yes. But are there certain sins that we ought to be more grieved about and pay more attention to? Are there certain sins that we ought to see as a log as opposed to just a speck of dust? And the answer is yes, in this sense, that our own sin should be the sin that we find most bothersome. Does that make sense? There's a good chance people could misunderstand you with what you're teaching on page 5 when you say, oh, there are some sins that are bigger than other sins. If you say that, it's going to sound like you don't understand sin. What you are saying is there are sins that ought to have our attention, that ought to be of a greater priority to us than other sins. And what are those sins that ought to be a greater priority to us? our own sin. The sin in my life, I ought to see that as a plank, as a log. And the sin in somebody else's life is to be less bothersome to me than my own sin. Does that make sense? Because I think that's what Jesus is teaching here. That when I look at somebody else who's caught in adultery, yet I don't see my own sin in my own life, what Jesus is saying is you're being a hypocrite, and you're not to judge that way. Because when you judge that way, that's no better than giving like a hypocrite, or praying like a hypocrite, or fasting like a hypocrite. You can also judge like a hypocrite. So that's the point that you're making here. What is Jesus not saying? He's not saying that we can't identify sin. What is he saying? He's saying that our own sin ought to be massively troublesome to us, and that's where we need to start. All right. Now, you make a third point. It's found on page 6. And by the way, there's a good little teaching tip here that will help you illustrate that second point found on the top of page 6. But in the middle of page 6, you're going to make your last point, which is this. The goal of judgment and the goal of judging sin is to help others with their sin. At the end of the day, that's what it's about. And you even hear that in Jesus' words. Listen, he says, first, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. The reason Jesus wants us to practice unhypocritical judgment is because then and only then will we have the ability to help our friends and others who are trapped in sin, which is exactly what Jesus did in John chapter 8, right? In the passage that's being preached Sunday. Jesus was able to help this woman abandon her life of sin, and ultimately that's the goal. Ultimately, that's why we have to remove the logs and the planks out of our own eye and get our stuff in order, because then and only then will we be able to help others walk rightly with God as well. And that third point there is really illustrated in the weekly memory verse. So you're going to teach through the lesson. It all ends right there on page 7. Now, as you know, once you're done teaching your part of the lesson, that's not the end of your time. That's just the end of your time as a teacher. From then, you move on into what we call an application moment. Now, if you're a brand new small group leader on Sunday mornings, and by the way, welcome to the fold. We're glad that you're starting these new groups. If you're a brand new teacher or if you're a returning teacher, let me remind you of what you ought to be doing at this point. You move into an application moment. Now that you've taught through Matthew chapter 7, you've made these 3 points. Now here's what you're going to do. Look at page 8 on your teaching materials here. This will show you exactly what you do. Just let me walk through this with you. A, it says divide your group into clusters of 4 or 5 people and then give them copies of the small group handout. You're going to have a small group handout that's provided for you in your folders on Sunday morning. And in fact, you've got these handouts, and on the back of it is some follow-up stuff for your group. But you're going to give these handouts out at this point now, and what you're doing is you've now broken your group into clusters of 4 or 5. And by the way, if your group's already that small, then you don't have to break them in half. Just let them function as a little cluster there, and you sort of get out of the way while they work through this part. But you're going to divide them into clusters, give them the handouts, then look at where we go from here. Point B, give your group a set amount of time to work through the handouts, maybe like 10 minutes. Then C, afterwards, if time permits, you can ask your group to kind of share out loud what you've taught together. If your group's real small and you've only got that one cluster, you may not have to do that part. But here's the whole point of these application moments. And by the way, if you want to see the handout that you'll distribute, look at page 10 on your teaching materials here. This is the handout that you're going to distribute. Here's why these handouts and this application moment is important, and why I hope that you don't just spend your whole class time lecturing your class. Here's why. If you don't do the application moment, you're cheating your group. Here's why. Number one, they need more than just your wisdom, okay? If you are the sole voice, they're getting the wisdom of one person. Whereas using these application moment cluster groups, now they're having input from other people who know things that you don't and who have wisdom that you don't. So this allows them to get collective wisdom. It also allows them to address maybe a question or a situation that they didn't want to bring up while you were teaching, okay? And think about it. If your teaching brings up a situation that somebody really needs an answer to, you don't want them to leave with that unresolved, do you? Of course you don't, because you're a good teacher. This allows some a chance to work that out with other people. So you've taught your lesson. Now you go into this application moment. You break them into clusters. You give them the handouts. You give them time to work through the handouts. And then when that's done, you just wrap it up with a nice, tidy conclusion. You've got that in your lesson on page 9. There's a nice, tidy conclusion there. And you'll notice in these lessons that we usually try and give you a conclusion that works up to the weekly memory verse, because that helps you make a nice, clean finish. And it also accents the point that there is a memory verse for the week, which is a good thing for you to point out. All right? But that's your lesson. It's going to be a really good one this week. And I tell you what I really like about this lesson. Not only is it a great complement to the sermon that's going to be taught this Sunday, it's going to be a great setup for the new series that begins the following Sunday. So I'm really, really glad that you're going to be teaching Matthew 7 to your group. I think it's going to be an aha moment for a lot of people, but I'm really glad you're teaching it. Thanks so much for investing into the lives of God's people here at Dayspring by teaching an on-campus small group. God bless you, and we'll see you Sunday.